Bonjour, hello, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Daniel Belin, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. I want to note before we begin that today's lecture is being recorded. Please make sure that your microphones are muted in order to avoid any interruptions. If you have any questions, we can use the chat box. There will be a moderated Q&A period after the lecture, and you are welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat function. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, or MISC as it's known, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events, such as the wonderful book launch that we have today. And these events are on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event, where we will hear from Jennifer Elrick about her new book, Making Middle-Class Multiculturalism, Bureaucrats and Policymaking in Postwar Canada. So this is her McGill book launch for this monograph. Jennifer is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at McGill University here in Montreal. Her research explores migration governance, diversity, and social stratification. The book, Making Middle-Class Multiculturalism, shows how bureaucrats' perceptions and judgments about the admissibility of individuals in socioeconomic, racial, and moral terms influence the creation of formal admissions criteria for skilled workers and family immigrants that continue to shape immigration to Canada. So I will now turn it over to Jennifer, and I will be back later for the Q&A session that will follow her presentation. So Jennifer, welcome, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Danielle. Thank you to you for the invitation, and thank you very much to everyone who's taken time out of their day, despite surely being zoomed out, to join us today and to hear me talk about my book. I appreciate you coming, and look forward to sharing this with you and having a bit of a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'll dive right in. My book contributes to a long-standing scholarly discussion in sociology, political science, and other disciplines about how and why countries like Canada, the United States, and Australia replace their explicitly racist immigration policies with so-called universal ones after World War II. Pictured here on the screen are two of many important works in the field, Culling the Masses by David Fitzgerald and David Cook Martin, and Becoming Multicultural by Phil Triadopoulos. Just to clarify up front, I use the term racist policies here as a shorthand for policies that selected immigrants based on national origins, which were often used as a proxy for racial and ethnic group membership. So until the post-war era, immigration laws in Canada and the other aforementioned countries sorted would-be immigrants into admissible and inadmissible groups based on the perceived compatibility of these groups with white settler nation-building projects. So in Canada, admissions criteria laid down in the first act after World War II, 1952 Immigration Act, which was very much a continuity of the past, defined admissible immigrants as people from the United Kingdom, France, Western, Northern Europe, and inadmissible immigrants from as being people from most other countries, but especially Asian ones, foremost China. And when I say that racist immigration policies were replaced by universal or non-discriminatory ones, I mean that states like Canada stopped selecting based on ascribed group memberships and started selecting individuals based on traits like human capital in the case of workers and social ties in the case of family. These policies are often called universal or non-discriminatory because formally anyone can apply and be subjected to the same evaluation criteria regardless of nationality, race, ethnicity, gender, or other social distinctions. So this change was made in Canada mostly in 1967 through the 1967 immigration regulations, which were later shored up in the 1976 Immigration Act. Similar changes took place in 1965 in the United States and 1973 in Australia. And these policies, especially Canada's, became a template for other contemporary immigration policies elsewhere, for example, in Europe. And the effect of these policies in Canada and elsewhere has been to create multicultural societies in demographic terms. So right after this policy was implemented, Canada saw a rapid decrease in European origin immigrants and a rapid increase in immigrants from other parts of the world as an overall proportion of permanent residents. And this has continued to this day. For 2019, a little dyslexia there. The top 10 source countries for Canada for permanent immigrants were India, China, the Philippines, Nigeria, Pakistan, Syria, Eritrea, Iran, and the United States. So these policies were very fundamental to shaping both the demographics that we have today. And we know already, due to existing scholarship, we know quite a lot about what was the factors that were driving this change from existing scholarship. We know that states like Canada were under enormous pressure to change due to a new normative political context that was emerging after World War II and that emphasized individual and human rights. We know that foreign policy ambitions exerted a strong pressure on immigration bureaucrats to create a new policy, as Canada, in light of this new normative political context, was looking to establish itself as a moral power on the world stage. We also know that there were pretty strong economic imperatives to bring in immigrants from other parts of the world because rivals from traditional source countries like the UK and Western Europe were declining. And we also know that there were some pretty formidable domestic political pressures at play exerted by ethnic groups like the Chinese and Japanese foremost, seeking equal treatment as Canadian citizens and historical contributors to nation building efforts. But a lot of what we know about this policy transition really focuses on these external pressures on the state, the Canadian state, and the Department of Citizenship and Immigration specifically to change. And much less attention has been paid to what was going on inside that department. When the Department of Citizenship and Immigration enters into these explanations, it's usually described as a factor hindering change. In other words, state actors in the department are depicted as dragging their heels, prolonging the transition through piecemeal legal changes, moving racist selection practices behind the scenes by creating vague instructions for immigrant selection that would allow bureaucrats processing cases to maintain their racist practices. This depiction has been brought to light in the existing literature based on archival records of strategic policy discussions among top civil servants, for example. But what these scholars to date have not taken into account, and which my book does, are records, archival records related to other activities within the department, which I argue tell a slightly different and definitely more nuanced story about what was going on inside the state at the time. So when I started rooting around in the archives, Library and Archives Canada, I was interested in looking at this transition myself. I started finding a lot of interesting documents that posed a bit of a puzzle. And these documents are exemplified by the document cited here, which is a memorandum from the Director of Immigration at the time, C.E.S. Smith, to the Deputy Minister of the time, Laval Fortier, regarding an application from a Chinese-Canadian couple in Victoria, BC, to admit 2 Chinese children for adoption. And in this memo, the director writes, I recommend favorably in this case. And the deputy minister responds in a handwritten note at the end of the document, approved on the 10th of February, 1959. We should note this type of case. It is already 2 cases in less than 6 months. Now, this document I found to be rather puzzling after further investigations and being familiar with what was happening with immigration policy at the time for 3 reasons. The first was that the deputy minister and the director of immigration were agreeing to admit children for adoption in 1959. Now, if you're familiar with Canadian immigration policy at the time, in 1959, there were no provisions for admitting adopted children from anywhere in the world. They were not considered eligible family members under immigration law until much later, 1967, or 8 years later, after this memo was written. The other puzzling thing about documents, this specific document, was the origins of the family and the prospective adoptees, all of whom were of Chinese origin. Those of you familiar with Canadian immigration history will know that the Chinese have historically been subject to the strongest racial exclusions under Canadian immigration policy. From 1923 to 1910, Canada's policy was so restrictive towards Chinese individuals that only 15 were admitted to Canada in that 24-year period. And so this is puzzling. You know, if we have this standard narrative of immigration bureaucrats resisting policy change and eager to hold on to racist provisions, why admit Chinese children, adopted Chinese children at that, when they are under absolutely no legal obligation to even consider the case? Another puzzling thing about this document is who is making the decision, namely the deputy minister and the director of immigration, who are what we would consider high-level immigration bureaucrats. Normally, these type of state actors are tasked with designing and writing policy, not processing immigration cases, which is a task left to lower level or street level immigration bureaucrats. And the procedure they're using is very interesting. What they end up issuing at the end of this document is a so-called order in council, which, for those of you who are not familiar with this, is a legislative instrument in Canadian law that allows the executive, ministers, to table laws that are signed into effect by the Governor General without first being put before Parliament. So in this case, a legal decree was being issued that these 2 individuals who had no right to entry under Canadian immigration law should be allowed to enter the country. Okay, you may say, that's interesting. That's one document. What's the big deal? So I started searching a bit more, and the more of these documents that I found, the more I realized actually this is a pretty big deal. Now, it's hard to know how many immigrants were admitted via order in council against immigration regulations in the post-war period overall, and it's even harder to know then what proportion of cases were approved. Records are very patchy. But this figure here was one that I managed to find in a memorandum on the subject, one of the very few, which covered the period of 1950 to 1960. And you can see here in light gray, the number of permanent immigrants admitted in each year. And in dark blue, you can see the number of immigrants admitted via order in council in the same year. So yes, admittedly, this is a small proportion of yearly admissions for the period that we can find information on, but it's still at the height, going from 1956 onwards, is in the area of thousands per year. And the interesting thing is that this was all perfectly legal and built into the immigration system. The Immigration Acts of 1910 and 1952 gave the minister the authority to use orders in council as a legal instrument at their discretion. And the scope of this discretion was huge. It included the power to admit or exclude any individual or group, notwithstanding the provisions of the Immigration Act and accompanying regulations, including ones, and this is important for this talk, delimiting selection by racial and national origin groups. In effect, then, these ordering councils were a carte blanche for the minister of the day and his or her advisors to do with what they wanted. And I argue in my book that the discretionary implementation or case processing practices of these high-level bureaucrats, like the deputy minister, head of the immigration branch, heads of ports of entry, special immigration officers, and others, are an overlooked but very important part of the story of how Canada's universal immigration policy came about. The interpretive work that went into these decisions, who are these individuals, can they be part of the Canadian nation, influenced policy before it became official and enshrined in law. Usually we think of implementation as something that shapes policy after the fact, and I'm arguing that it was instrumental in the development of that policy in the first place. So I base my argument on a qualitative content analysis of archival records from the Department of Citizenship and Immigration, which are held at Library and Archives Canada. I won't go into detail on these now, but I'm happy to discuss them further in the Q&A. And the documents I looked at covered the period from 1952 to 1967. Why that period? Because in 1952, we have the first post-war Immigration Act in Canada, which very much kept the racist group-based selections. And in 1967, we see the immigration regulations that really universalize admissions for skilled workers and family members. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on two types of records. One is ordering council admissions that were undertaken between 1956 and 1967, which contain records of 1954 to 1964, sorry, my eyes went somewhere else, contains records of a little over 1,700 individuals who were considered for admission despite their inadmissibility due to their national origins. And I'm also going to talk to you a bit about deportation appeals, 961 of which are held covering the period of 1956 to 1967. Now, why deportation appeals? I argue that these are the flip side of the admissions coin, right? If we have ordering council admissions, where we're asking who can be admitted, deportation appeals, they ask a similar question: who can be permitted to stay within the borders? And they're important for this particular policy transition, which is focused on how the state views and interprets race, because these two groupings of records deal with people of different origins. So the ordering council admissions cover majority non-European origin individuals, whereas the deportation appeals, interestingly, cover majority European origin individuals, for example, from Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And since, if we're talking about a transition from, group-based assessments to individual assessments, and where the place of race is and all of that, it is, I think, important to look at these interpretations of cases for both individuals from so-called preferred national origins, as well as from non-preferred national origins. I won't go into detail on the theoretical lens applied in the data analysis, but I'm happy to discuss it in the Q&A. But my goal in analyzing these documents was to evaluate these individual cases and discern, how did immigration bureaucrats talk about these individuals? What made them acceptable as individuals, regardless of their racial, ethnic, and national origins? Now, I'm going to go into a few details of the analysis, but if I'm moving too quickly for you in this talk, you're more than welcome to buy the book and refer to chapter 4, or if you like, you can also see my recent article in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which gives ample details about today's talk. which will focus mainly on skilled worker admissions. If you're also interested in the family admissions piece, you'll have to refer to the book or ask me in the Q&A. So my analysis can be summarized to a small extent in this figure, which shows how Order in Council admissions were relevant to both the process of post-war immigration policy change in Canada and its substance. In terms of process, I argue that Order in Council admissions, and I show that Order in Council admissions preceded official policy changes when it comes to at least 3 groups of immigrants: Asian fiancés, who are represented in blue, non-European skilled workers, who are represented in yellow, and adopted children, who appear in red. Now you'll see that here, 1952, the start of our analysis, you'll see that, so I should mention, the analysis goes from 1952 to 1967. What we see here in 1962 is actually a partial legislative change, partially universalizing skilled worker admissions, but not quite changing provisions for family immigration, and also not systematizing skilled worker admissions as much as it was in 1967. So what you'll see in the case of all 3 of these groups, that the admissions are happening from a much earlier point than either this official 1962 deadline or even the 1967 legislative change. Adopted children are being admitted in practice on a regular basis from 1953 onwards, non-European skilled workers from 1955, and Asian fiancés from approximately 1956. And I argue that these admissions amount to a process of low-risk experimentation with universal, paved the way for big policy changes that later appeared on the books. Now, in terms of substance, I argue that Order in Council admissions and also deportation appeals affected the content of selection criteria for skilled workers and family members, because the cumulative results of boundary work in these cases fed into the language of immigration regulations, foremost into the personal assessment, which was awarded a lot of points under the original point system that was applied to skilled workers and extended family members. And it's hard to see what work those criteria do without seeing how they emerged and evolved in reference to concrete cases. So let's have a brief look at how these criteria emerged in Order in Council and Order in Council admissions and deportation appeals. Now, in both cases, as you might expect, there was an emphasis on economic utility. In other words, individuals from inadmissible groups, non-European origins, for example, were granted admission via Order in Council, often because they had things like a job offer, were professionals, had post-secondary education and or owned a business. This is unsurprising given the emphasis on economic utility in our immigration policy, that's well known. But equally, and sometimes more important, were cultural assessments of status and moral worth. And this is, this is things like characteristics like being in steady employment, engaging in practices that were asset building. Sorry, I just lost my spot. Where was it? Asset building, something that denotes thrift or ambition, military or community service. And it also involved value judgments, general value judgments, like someone being of a good type or having good prospects or making a favorable impression. And the deportation appeals, when you analyze them, underscore this importance of the cultural assessments of status and moral worth. These are very interesting documents. They're each about 2 to 3 pages long, describing someone who's been ordered deported for a violation of immigration law, usually through the violation of some other law, which has put them in poor standing, quite often things like drug use or having mental or other health issues. And the interesting thing is that nowhere in these appeals is it disputed that the person did the thing that they were accused of and or convicted of. That's taken as a given. The entire discussion focuses on who this person is and whether or not they're worth keeping anyway. In other words, the focus is on their so-called record in Canada, a holistic discussion of who people are. The interesting thing is that these denials, particularly denials of immigration appeals, deportation appeals, they don't map consistently or cleanly onto any national origins or any reason for deportation or onto economic utility. But they are consistently associated with things like being in steady unemployment, which having that designation led to a rejection of the appeal in 78% of cases. Having a bad attitude, being itinerant or dishonorable, led to a denial in 100% of cases, as it did in cases where people were described as immature, lazy, stupid, or irresponsible. Very rarely were these appeal decisions correlated with occupation, and where they were, the occupations had a moral dimension. So people who were sex workers had their appeals denied in 81% of cases. On the flip side of things, owning a business reduced the denial rate to 33%. So in sum, what we can see in these bodies of documents is how admissibility becomes detached from membership in racial, ethnic, and national groups. And the focus comes to be on individual socioeconomic and moral traits. And I can't show it here in the talk, but the terminology in these decisions is subsequently institutionalized and scaled up. And you can see this in the wording that subsequently appears in the immigration manual, which is given to lower level immigration officers on how to award points for the individual assessment, personal assessment. So what does this convergence around socioeconomic and moral selection criteria for individuals from both of these desirable and undesirable immigrant groups mean for our understanding of the transition a racist to a universal immigration policy? We see that the universal immigration policy for skilled workers and family immigrants that emerged in Canada after World War II was never designed to be race-free, but was designed to manage racial diversity through class. But the records clearly show that immigration bureaucrats in the department never came to view non-European groups in general as somehow favorable all of a sudden. They just developed a way of seeing individuals as admissible, notwithstanding their origins. And I argue that the common ground they found for admitting individuals of diverse origins emphasized middle-class traits as a basis for social cohesion. This made the demographic multiculturalism that emerged under this new immigration policy a middle-class multiculturalism. And in using the term middle class, I draw on Michel Lamont's description of the term as denoting a group defined in socioeconomic, cultural, and moral terms. Lamont in her work identifies a range of relatively stable moral distinctions denoting middle classness, including ambition, dependability, self-reliance, discipline, being a patriotic and responsible citizen, perseverance, audacity, self-mastery, long-term planning, and I could name more. And these are just the kind of descriptors and language used in the assessments of orders in council and deportation appeals. Now, I'm not arguing that any of this was necessarily strategic or deliberate from the onset. But instead was a mode of selection that emerged over time in practice. As these ministers were confronted with large numbers of cases and just trying to muddle through and making sense of them in light of the known external pressures that I've already mentioned. Nevertheless, what these documents show in the archives is that some documents reveal that the bureaucrats themselves came to recognize a certain logic over time in their practices. Canada, as it emerged from World War II, was a middle power in the world, and it was competing strongly with the United States and the United Kingdom for influence. And immigration bureaucrats talked about these other countries quite often and noted in several documents, and I quote, social problems generated by mixing the problems of race and poverty in the United States and the United Kingdom. They discussed the racial riots in the United Kingdom and described them as linked to immigration by, and I quote, unskilled persons who settled in urban areas and fell victim to poverty and squalor and created a social problem. The department was keen on, and I quote again, avoiding the tragic examples of Britain and the United States. And they were convinced that managing demographic multiculturalism properly by avoiding the intersection of race and poverty, low skill, the low class element that they were seeing, had the potential to, and I quote, enable Canada to give a striking example to the world and to adopt a position of leadership at this difficult time when racial problems are so pressing. So in conclusion, I would like to offer three key takeaways from the book. The first is the importance of theorizing and analyzing micro-level interpretive practices, including case processing activities, as part of the policy formulation process. The historical Canadian case shows that they are integral to understanding both the process of policy formulation and its substantive outcomes. The nature of this individual group distinction and admissibility, and the specificities of selection criteria that were institutionalized. Now, the fair question remains of whether or not these findings are an artifact of the Westminster system. Like in Canada, I think some comparative work could help answer that. The second takeaway that I would like to offer you is how theorizing and analyzing these micro-level interpretive practices in the historical Canadian case shifts the historiography of post-war immigration policy change in Canada. It occurred along a different timeline than the one that is painted by simply reading legislative changes. And the role of state actors in the Department of Citizenship and Immigration is different. These state actors were architects of change. They were not just throwing up racist roadblocks to this change, but their relationship to change was much more complicated, as was their treatment of the notion of race as an element of immigrant selection. The third thing I would like to leave you with is that the middle-class multiculturalism created by immigration bureaucrats and institutionalized in post-war policy certainly has negative implications for social stratification that we need to consider further. The OECD and a number of other countries regularly refer to the Canadian model as an example of best practice when it comes to managing mass immigration and official multiculturalism. I consider some of the overlooked downsides to this model in the conclusion of the book. This is a little more speculative than is because it's not directly related to the data analysis, the historical data analysis in the book. But I think we need to have an eye on both the material and the normative implications of the tools created by these immigration bureaucrats. Materially, the post-war selection criteria and instruments that they created have really lent themselves to increasing socioeconomic selectivity in skilled workers and family admissions. And I think while these selectivity is definitely tied to broader social and economic trends, these specific tools that were crafted were definitely a facilitating factor. And while access to skilled worker admissions may now be highly racially diverse, these selection tools developed in the 1960s have absolutely generated intersectional selection effects. There is a gendered disadvantage that I'm not able to talk about here, but especially at the intersection of gender and race, we see that all is not well or equal. Normatively, I'd say middle-class multicultural nation building through immigration over the last 70 years has colored Canadians' perceptions of who good immigrants are, and possibly by extension, who good Canadians are. And I think this emphasis on middle-class socioeconomic status has the potential for eroding socioeconomic solidarity beyond the middle class. So if having middle class status is needed to be considered a full member in the Canadian national community, what does it mean for those who are not immigrant or non-immigrant? And I think it also has the potential to erode support for a range of other immigrant groups. Political scientist Scott Blinder has argued that what he calls imagined immigration, who people think immigrants are, is very much tied to public support for different policies. And if we imagine good immigrants to be middle-class immigrants, I think this imagined immigration could erode support for groups who are imagined as outside of that middle classness. For example, low-skilled immigrants, as well as refugees and asylum seekers. So those are the thoughts I would like to leave you with today. Thank you very much for attending. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. And you're also welcome to get in touch with me via email if your question comes to you a bit later.